They told him it was impossible. 20 machine guns, they said. Maybe 30. No other explanation for the hell they'd just walked into. But when the German officer finally dragged the truth out of his terrified soldiers, what he heard made his blood run cold. 8 men. 8 Australian riflemen with bolt-action rifles that were already obsolete when his grandfather was born, and they'd just torn his entire company to shreds. You think you know the story of World War II? You think you've heard it all? The American Garands, the German machine guns, the technological race that defined modern warfare? Well, I'm about to show you something that every military historian has been desperately trying to ignore for 80 years. Because what happened when Australian soldiers picked up the Lee-Enfield didn't just break the rules of warfare, it shattered everything we thought we knew about firepower, technology, and what actually wins battles. The Germans called it impossible. The Japanese refused to believe it. The Americans tried to cover it up. And when you find out what a sheep farmer from Queensland could do with 30 rounds of .303 ammunition, you'll understand why Rommel himself rewrote his tactical doctrine just to avoid facing them. This isn't a story about superior weapons or advanced technology. This is about what happens when you hand an obsolete rifle to men who've been shooting since they could walk. And trust me, by the time we're done here, you're going to understand exactly why enemy soldiers would rather face a machine gun nest than 8 diggers with Lee-Enfields. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about the weapons that actually won the war. The German machine gunner's hands were shaking as he raised them above the trench parapet. Blood streamed from a gash across his forehead, and his eyes held the wide-eyed terror of a man who'd just witnessed something impossible. When the Australian sergeant hauled him up, the prisoner kept repeating the same phrase in broken English. Not one rifle. Not one rifle. The interrogator leaned in closer, confused. "What do you mean, mate?" The German's voice cracked as he gestured wildly at the smoking battlefield. "We thought you had 20 machine guns. 20 machine guns firing at us." The Australians exchanged glances, then burst into laughter. "That wasn't 20 machine guns, Fritz. That was 8 blokes with Lee-Enfields. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of the Pacific, and the frozen trenches of the Western Front, German and Japanese soldiers reported the same terrifying phenomenon. When Australian infantry opened fire, the enemy genuinely believed they were facing massed automatic weapons. They weren't. They were facing something far more deadly. Diggers who'd been shooting rabbits since they were 7 years old, armed with a rifle the British High Command considered obsolete. But what happened next would shock even the most experienced German officers. Because this wasn't just about one confused prisoner or one lucky firefight. This was about to become a pattern that would haunt the Wehrmacht across 3 continents. The short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark III, the SMLE. The weapon that won 2 world wars not through technological superiority, but through the bloody-minded refusal of Australian farm boys to accept that 15 aimed shots per minute was impossible. The British Army qualification standard was 15 rounds per minute. The Australians, they treated that as a warm-up. 25 to 30 rounds per minute was common among experienced diggers. Some could push it to 40. And unlike the spray and pray tactics that would dominate later wars, these were aimed shots, killing shots. The history books don't tell you this story. Because admitting that a rifle designed in 1895 outperformed every semi-automatic weapon of World War II meant admitting something the brass hated to acknowledge. That training mattered more than technology. That a man who'd grown up culling kangaroos at 400 yards didn't need a fancy American Garand. He just needed 30 rounds of .303 British, a clear field of fire, and someone stupid enough to charge his position. Yet the British War Office had tried to kill this rifle 3 times before 1939. Each time they'd failed. And the reason why would soon become written in German blood across the North African desert. The Lee-Enfield wasn't supposed to be a rapid-fire weapon. British military doctrine in the late 19th century emphasized volley fire, controlled salvos delivered on command. The rifle's design reflected this conservative thinking. A 10-round magazine when most military rifles held 5. A smooth bolt action that prioritized speed over the Mauser's theoretically superior locking mechanism. The British wanted a rifle that could deliver sustained fire in the hands of professional soldiers. What they got was a weapon perfectly suited to the Australian character. Simple, reliable, and absolutely devastating when pushed beyond its design limits. The Australians didn't invent rapid bolt-action fire. That honour belongs to the British riflemen who stopped German advances at Mons in 1914, their Lee-Enfields firing so fast the Germans reported facing machine guns. But the Australians perfected it. They turned it into an art form. Because while British soldiers were professional troops following doctrine, Australian soldiers were competitive bastards who'd grown up in a culture where being second best at anything was unacceptable. What the training manuals won't tell you is that the Lee-Enfield's secret went far deeper than anyone suspected. And when Rommel's Afrika Korps discovered this secret at Tobruk, it would change German tactical doctrine forever. The Lee-Enfield secret wasn't just the smooth bolt action or the 10-round magazine, it was the Mad Minute, a drill developed by the British Army where soldiers had 60 seconds to fire as many aimed shots as possible at a target 300 yards away. Pass rate: 15 hits. The Australians looked at that standard and laughed. Blokes in the Australian Imperial Force regularly scored 25 to 30 hits. Some exceptional shooters pushed past 40. One documented case shows an Australian corporal landing 38 hits at 300 yards in 60 seconds. 38 killing shots. Think about that. While you're reading this sentence, a digger could have emptied his rifle, reloaded with 2 fresh charges, and started on his 3rd magazine. This wasn't just about speed. Anyone can work a bolt fast if accuracy doesn't matter. The terrifying reality of Australian marksmanship was that these rapid shots were hitting targets at ranges where enemy soldiers thought they were safe. The SMLE's sights were calibrated out to 2,000 yards, absurdly optimistic for most armies. Australian soldiers regularly engaged targets at 600 to 800 yards, not harassing fire, aimed fire, kill shots. But the real nightmare was about to unfold in a way that would make even seasoned German veterans question everything they knew about infantry combat. The secret lay in the design of the bolt itself. Unlike the Mauser pattern rifles used by Germany, the Lee-Enfield's bolt handle sat at the rear of the receiver. This meant the shooter's hand traveled a shorter distance during the bolt cycle. Milliseconds saved on each shot. Multiply that across 30 rounds, and you're talking about several seconds of sustained fire that an enemy simply wasn't prepared for. Australian ingenuity pushed this further. The manual said you should work the bolt with your whole hand, palm over the knob. The diggers said bugger that. They learned to manipulate the bolt with just their fingers, keeping their firing hand in position, barely moving the rifle from their shoulder. Faster, smoother, deadlier. Load the rifle with 2 5-round charges. Press them down into the magazine with your thumb. The empty charger clips eject automatically. Bolt forward, round chambered, eye back on the target. 10 shots before you need to reload. 10 shots that could be delivered in less than 20 seconds by an experienced soldier. And when that magazine ran dry, experienced diggers could reload in under 3 seconds. 2 fresh charges slammed home, bolt worked, back in the fight before the enemy realized the shooting had even paused. The British officers hated it. All this cowboy shooting, they called it. Wasteful, undisciplined. The Australian response? Show us on the casualty list where our undisciplined shooting was a problem. Then came April 1941. Tobruk, the place where everything the Germans thought they knew about infantry warfare was about to be shattered. North Africa, 1942. Tobruk, the fortress that wasn't supposed to hold. Rommel's Afrika Korps had smashed through every defensive line from the Egyptian border to the Libyan coast. Professional German troops, battle-hardened from victories in France and Poland, supported by Italian divisions and backed by the best tanks in the Desert War. Against them stood the 9th Australian Division, the Rats of Tobruk, dug into positions around a port the British High Command had already written off as indefensible. The Germans came expecting another quick victory. What they got was a nightmare of Australian marksmanship that turned their standard infantry tactics into suicide. German doctrine called for infantry to advance under covering fire from machine guns and mortars, closing to grenade range before assaulting enemy positions. It worked brilliantly against British and French troops who'd fire carefully aimed shots, following doctrine, conserving ammunition. Against the Australians, German soldiers found themselves walking into a storm of rifle fire so intense they couldn't advance, couldn't retreat, could only dive for whatever cover existed and pray. One documented German after-action report from April 1941 describes an assault on Australian positions near the perimeter. The attack began at 0530 with artillery support, textbook German tactics. The Australian positions were suppressed, or so the Germans thought. The infantry advanced across 800 yards of open ground. At 600 yards, the first Australian shots rang out. Not harassing fire, precision shooting. The German report noted that within the first minute of engagement, they'd lost 12 men to head and chest shots. Snipers, the German commander assumed. He called for more artillery to suppress the Australian snipers. What the Germans didn't know was that their real problems had only just begun. Because these weren't snipers at all. These were ordinary Australian infantrymen doing what they'd been taught since childhood. Aim small, miss small. The artillery barrage ended. The Germans advanced again. At 400 yards, the firing intensified. Not the steady crack, crack, crack of careful aimed fire. A continuous rolling thunder that sounded exactly like machine guns. The German soldiers went to ground, convinced they were facing heavy automatic weapons. Their radios crackled with requests for tank support to suppress the Australian machine gun nests. No tanks came, because British intelligence had already told the Germans that the Australians were desperately short of machine guns. Most platoons were lucky to have one Bren gun. The rest made do with rifles. So if these weren't machine guns, what the hell were they facing? The answer terrified them more than machine guns would have. Individual riflemen firing so fast and accurately that an 8-man section could deliver the same firepower as a heavy machine gun team. The German assault stalled at 300 yards. Officers screamed for their men to advance. The men refused, because advancing into that curtain of fire meant certain death. Not the random chance of catching a bullet, certain death. Because the Australians weren't shooting at areas, they were shooting at men. And at 300 yards, a digger who'd grown up shooting roos for the dinner table didn't miss. But the story gets worse, much worse. Because what happened in the next assault would become a cautionary tale whispered in German barracks from Libya to the Eastern Front. The Germans withdrew. Their after-action report listed casualties at 37, killed and wounded, from a single platoon-strength attack against what they estimated was a company of Australians, supported by at least 6 machine guns. The reality: 28 Australian soldiers with Lee-Enfields and 1 Bren gun that jammed after the first magazine. 28 men had stopped 100-plus German assault through sheer volume of accurate fire. Rommel himself acknowledged the problem. In his personal papers, later captured by British intelligence, he wrote that Australian defensive positions required different tactics than British or American positions. His conclusion: avoid direct infantry assaults on Australian-held ground unless absolutely necessary. Use artillery, use tanks, use air support, but don't send infantry into rifle range of diggers unless you're prepared to accept catastrophic casualties. This wasn't respect born of propaganda or reputation. This was cold tactical assessment from one of the finest military minds of World War II. The Australians had turned an obsolete bolt-action rifle into a weapon system that fundamentally altered German tactical planning. Not through some technological breakthrough, through practice, through culture, through the stubborn refusal to accept limitations that other armies considered immutable. Yet even this wasn't the most terrifying application of the Lee-Enfield. That horror was reserved for when the diggers went on the attack. The real horror of the SMLE wasn't in defensive positions. It was in the attack. Because a rifle that could deliver sustained rapid fire, while stationary, became something altogether more terrifying in the hands of soldiers who'd learned to shoot while moving. British doctrine said, you don't fire while advancing. You advance under covering fire, go to ground, deliver aimed shots, then advance again under covering fire from other elements. Slow, methodical, safe. The Australians looked at that doctrine and filed it in the same mental drawer as shining boots and saluting officers. Useful for garrison duty, useless for killing Germans. Australian infantry tactics evolved something the British called walking fire. Advancing soldiers would work their Lee-Enfield bolts while moving, firing from the hip or shoulder at any target that presented itself. Not aimed precision fire at long range. Rapid suppressive fire at close range, delivered while closing with the enemy. It violated every principle of marksmanship. It wasted ammunition. It was wildly inaccurate compared to stationary shooting. It was also absolutely devastating in close combat. Because here's what happened when Australian infantry advanced under walking fire. The enemy had to make a choice: stay in position and shoot back at targets that were moving, firing, and closing the distance, or keep your head down and wait for the Australians to reach grenade range. Neither option was good. The Germans found that shooting at advancing Australians was like shooting at a swarm of hornets. Even if you hit one, there were 7 more still coming, still firing. And if you kept your head down, the Australians would be in your trench before you realized how close they'd gotten. Then the war shifted to the Pacific, and if the Germans thought Australian marksmanship was terrifying, they had no idea what was coming for the Japanese. Kokoda Track, 1942, Papua New Guinea. A different war, a different enemy, the same rifle. The Japanese Imperial Army was arguably the finest jungle infantry force in the world. They'd conquered Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies in a series of lightning campaigns that stunned Western military observers. Their soldiers were tough, experienced, and trained in jungle warfare tactics that British and American armies were still trying to understand. They moved through terrain that Western troops considered impassable. They attacked at night. They used infiltration tactics to bypass strong points. They were, by any objective measure, superior jungle fighters to the Australian militia units thrown against them. Except for one problem, the Australians had Lee-Enfields and knew how to use them, and in the close-range chaos of jungle combat, rapid fire mattered more than tactical sophistication. The Japanese discovered this the hard way at Isurava, at Brigade Hill, at Eora Creek, places where Australian soldiers, most of them barely trained militia, stopped the Japanese advance not through superior tactics or better equipment, but through sheer volume of rifle fire delivered at ranges so close that missing was almost impossible. The jungle fighting on the Kokoda Track was nothing like the open desert warfare of North Africa. Engagement ranges dropped from hundreds of yards to tens of yards, sometimes less. Visibility was measured in feet, not hundreds of yards. The tactical advantage of long-range marksmanship disappeared. What mattered now was who could get the most lead into the air in the shortest time. And in that equation, the Lee-Enfield's 10-round magazine and smooth bolt action became a decisive advantage. What happened next at Eora Creek would become one of the most closely guarded secrets in Japanese military records, because admitting the truth would mean admitting the impossible. Japanese after-action reports from Kokoda, translated post-war, reveal the same pattern seen in North Africa. Repeated references to Australian automatic weapons, requests for more machine guns to counter Australian firepower, complaints that Australian positions were too heavily defended to assault with standard infantry tactics. But Allied intelligence knew the Australians on Kokoda were desperately short of machine guns. Some companies were down to 1 or 2 Bren guns for the entire unit. What the Japanese were experiencing wasn't massed automatic fire. It was militia soldiers, many of them teenagers, working their bolt-action rifles faster than Japanese planners thought possible. One Japanese officer's diary, captured at Gona, describes an attack on an Australian position at Eora Creek. The entry is clinical in its detail. The attack began at 0300 hours, taking advantage of darkness and the presumed exhaustion of Australian defenders. The Japanese plan called for infiltration, followed by a sudden close-range assault. The infiltration succeeded. Japanese soldiers reached to within 30 yards of the Australian positions undetected. Then someone stepped on a branch. The Australian response was immediate and catastrophic. Rifle fire erupted from positions the Japanese thought were lightly defended, not scattered shots from surprise sentries. A wall of fire that lit up the jungle and shredded the attacking force. The Japanese officer recorded that his company lost 43 men in less than 2 minutes, killed or wounded by rifle fire so intense that survivors reported being unable to return fire effectively. The attack collapsed. The company withdrew. The officer's conclusion: the Australian position was defended by at least a full company with extensive automatic weapons. The reality shocked even Allied intelligence when they pieced it together weeks later. 19 Australian soldiers, 16 of them militia, with less than 3 months training. The reality: 19 Australian soldiers, 16 of them militia, with less than 3 months training. 2 Bren guns, 17 Lee-Enfields. The Bren guns jammed after the first burst, as they often did in the humidity and mud of the jungle. Everything else was bolt-action fire from soldiers who'd learned the mad minute in training and practiced it every night since landing in Papua. 19 men had stopped a company-strength night attack through rapid rifle fire. The Japanese never discovered how few Australians they'd actually faced. To admit that would mean admitting their elite jungle infantry had been stopped by a handful of militia with obsolete rifles. But the most humiliating discovery was yet to come, and it would arrive in the form of American soldiers carrying the world's most advanced battle rifle. Perhaps the most telling testament to the Lee-Enfield's effectiveness came from the Americans. When U.S. forces arrived in the Pacific Theater, they came equipped with the M1 Garand, the finest battle rifle in the world, according to General Patton. A semi-automatic weapon that could deliver 8 shots as fast as you could pull the trigger. No bolt to work, no manual cycling, just point and shoot. The American Army was enormously proud of the Garand. They considered it a technological leap beyond the bolt-action rifles still used by British and Australian forces. Then American units started operating alongside Australian infantry. And a funny thing happened. The Americans noticed that, in sustained firefights, Australian sections often delivered equal or greater volumes of fire than American squads. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The Garand was semi-automatic. The Lee-Enfield was bolt-action. By every measure of mechanical advantage, American squads should have dominated in firepower. Except they didn't. Because the Garand's 8-round clip was its Achilles heel. When the clip ran dry, it ejected with a distinctive ping sound that experienced Japanese soldiers learned to listen for. The moment of vulnerability when an American soldier was reloading gave Japanese infantry a window to advance or return fire. The Lee-Enfield's 10-round magazine was reloaded manually with 2 5-round charges. No automatic ejection, no distinctive sound, and a well-trained Australian could reload so quickly that there was barely any pause in his rate of fire. American after-action reports from Bougainville and New Britain noted with surprise that Australian infantry sections seemed to maintain fire longer before reloading pauses than American squads using supposedly superior semi-automatic rifles. The reason was simple mathematics: 10 rounds versus 8, and the Australian ability to reload in under 3 seconds meant the practical sustained rate of fire was nearly equal to the Garand's semi-automatic advantage. Then came the request that the Pentagon tried desperately to suppress, because what happened next threatened to undermine America's entire narrative about technological superiority. Some American soldiers requested permission to carry Lee-Enfields instead of Garands. The requests were denied, of course. Can't have American troops admitting that an obsolete British rifle worked as well as modern American engineering. But the requests happened. There in the archives, American infantrymen, equipped with what was objectively a more advanced weapon, wanting to switch to bolt-action rifles because they'd seen what Australian soldiers could do with them. The British Army tried to replace the Lee-Enfield multiple times. The No. 4 rifle in 1941, the No. 5 jungle carbine in 1944. Each new variant was supposed to be an improvement, stronger, more accurate, better suited to modern warfare. The Australians kept using the old Mark III SMLE. Why? Because it worked. Because they knew it. Because changing rifles meant retraining muscle memory that had been developed over years of practice. The British could keep their improvements. The diggers would stick with what they knew. This conservatism wasn't nostalgia or resistance to change. It was practical acknowledgement that the Lee-Enfield in trained hands was good enough. Maybe not the most modern rifle, maybe not the most technologically advanced, but effective, reliable. And in infantry combat, effective and reliable beat modern and complex every single time. What emerged from post-war analysis would force military planners to confront an uncomfortable truth they'd been avoiding since 1914. The post-war analysis of Australian infantry effectiveness makes uncomfortable reading for military theorists because it suggests that training and culture matter more than equipment in determining combat effectiveness. The Australian Army didn't have better rifles than the Germans. They didn't have more machine guns than the Japanese. They didn't have the industrial base of the Americans or the professional military tradition of the British. What they had was a culture that valued practical shooting skills, a rifle that rewarded those skills, and an absolute refusal to accept that their lack of modern equipment made them inferior soldiers. German military analysis from 1946, compiled by former Wehrmacht officers for American intelligence, ranked Australian infantry among the most effective Allied ground forces, not because of superior tactics or equipment, because of marksmanship and aggression. The Germans noted that Australian soldiers shot better than British soldiers and fought with more initiative than American soldiers. The combination made them extremely difficult opponents in both defensive and offensive operations. This assessment came from the army that had conquered France in 6 weeks, that had pushed to the gates of Moscow, that had held the Western Allies at bay for nearly a year after D-Day. When professional German soldiers said the Australians were unusually effective infantry, they weren't offering compliments. They were explaining why certain tactical approaches didn't work against diggers. The Japanese assessment went even further, and what they admitted in classified interrogations would never be released to the public during their lifetimes. The Japanese assessment was even more pointed. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officers revealed that they'd developed specific tactical guidelines for engaging Australian forces. Never attempt to assault Australian positions without artillery preparation. Never assume Australian positions are lightly defended based on the volume of automatic fire. And never, under any circumstances, assume that Australian soldiers would surrender just because they were outnumbered or surrounded. This last point was critical. Japanese infantry tactics relied heavily on psychological pressure. Isolate enemy units, surround them, wait for them to realize their position is hopeless, and surrender. It worked brilliantly against Chinese forces. It worked against Filipino troops. It worked against British colonial forces. It didn't work against Australians, because surrounded diggers didn't surrender. They fought harder, and they kept fighting until they ran out of ammunition or the enemy withdrew. Milne Bay, August 1942. The first outright defeat of Japanese ground forces in the Pacific War. Australian militia and regular forces stopped a Japanese invasion not through superior numbers or better positions, but through sheer bloody-minded refusal to give ground. The Japanese landed with tanks, naval support, and numerical superiority. They expected to secure the airfield within days. Instead, they ran into Australian infantry, who fought from prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire, who refused to panic when tanks appeared, who maintained fire discipline even when wounded or under heavy pressure. The Japanese withdrew after 2 weeks of fighting. Their post-operation report cited unexpectedly heavy Australian resistance, extensive automatic weapons in Australian positions, fanatic refusal to surrender even when overrun. The reality: militia units with 1 machine gun per platoon and Lee-Enfield rifles, no tanks, limited artillery, just infantry doing what Australian infantry did best, shooting straight and refusing to quit. But the Lee-Enfield story didn't end with World War II. What happened next would prove that sometimes old solutions work better than new technology. The Lee-Enfield remained in Australian service until 1958, when the Army finally replaced it with the L1A1 self-loading rifle. There was genuine resistance from older soldiers who'd carried the SMLE through 2 world wars. The new rifle was lighter. It was semi-automatic. It was objectively better by every measurable standard. And the veterans hated it, because it wasn't a Lee-Enfield, because it didn't feel right, because they'd learned to fight with a weapon that rewarded skill and practice, and now they were being handed a rifle that any idiot could shoot adequately without years of training. This resistance wasn't just nostalgia. It reflected a deeper truth about the relationship between Australian soldiers and their rifles. The Lee-Enfield wasn't just a tool. It was a partner. You learned its quirks. You knew exactly how much pressure was needed on the trigger. You understood the slight kick to the left that required compensation. You'd fired so many rounds through it that working the bolt was as natural as breathing. Switching to a new rifle meant starting over, learning new muscle memory, trusting a weapon you didn't know in situations where trust meant survival. The last Australian combat use of the Lee-Enfield came in Vietnam. Special Forces soldiers, given the choice of modern weapons, sometimes opted to carry SMLE rifles on long-range patrols. Not because they were better than modern alternatives, because they were quieter, because a bolt-action rifle doesn't have the distinctive mechanical sound of a semi-automatic cycling, because in the jungle, where sound carried and silence meant survival, an old rifle from the First World War was sometimes the best tool for the job. And that brings us to the final, most important lesson, the one that modern armies still refuse to fully accept. That's the real legacy of the Lee-Enfield in Australian service. Not the rifle itself, but what Australian soldiers did with it. They took a weapon designed for 19th century warfare and turned it into one of the most effective infantry weapons of the 20th century. Not through modification or improvement, through practice, through culture, through the absolute refusal to accept that being outgunned meant being beaten. The German soldier who thought he was facing machine guns at Tobruk wasn't wrong, exactly. He was facing something that delivered the same effect as machine guns, something that poured so much accurate fire into his advancing company that continuing the attack meant certain death. He was just wrong about what was doing the shooting. Not machine guns, not super weapons, just Australian soldiers with bolt-action rifles doing what they'd been taught since childhood. Aim straight, shoot fast, and keep shooting until the other bloke stops moving. That's the horror of the .303 short magazine Lee-Enfield. Not the rifle itself. The rifle was just metal and wood, no different from thousands of other military rifles of the era. The horror was what happened when you put that rifle in the hands of men who'd grown up in a culture that valued practical shooting, who'd been culling livestock and hunting for meat since they were old enough to shoulder a rifle, who approached warfare with the same matter-of-fact pragmatism they brought to every other aspect of life in the Australian bush. You didn't need fancy technology to win battles. You needed straight shooting and the guts to keep fighting when any reasonable person would have surrendered. The Australians had both, and they had a rifle that rewarded those qualities. The Germans learned this at Tobruk. The Japanese learned it at Kokoda. Every enemy who faced Australian infantry learned it, usually the hard way. The lesson was simple. Don't assume that old equipment means obsolete soldiers. Don't assume that volume of fire requires automatic weapons. And most importantly, don't assume that a sheep farmer from Queensland who's been shooting roosts since he was 7 years old will be any less effective with a rifle than a professional soldier with 10 times the training. Because when that sheep farmer gets behind a Lee-Enfield and someone tells him to hold a position, he'll pour so much lead down range that you'll swear you're facing a machine gun nest. And when your officers order you to advance anyway, you'll walk into a curtain of aimed fire that will cut your unit to pieces before you even realize what's happening. Not because the Australians have better weapons, because they know how to use the weapons they've got. That's the real story of the SMLE, a rifle that was good enough in the hands of soldiers who were better than they had any right to be. The British designed it, the Australians perfected it, and every enemy who faced them learned to fear the distinctive sound of Lee-Enfield bolts working faster than doctrine said was possible.